name's Jake Mudge and I'm a priest of the Diocese of Sandhurst in central Victoria. And apart from parish ministry in the parish I work at St Teresa's in Kennington, I also spend 2 days a week teaching here in Melbourne at Catholic Theological College as well. So my background before training to be a priest was as an osteopath and in science. So that was a really enjoyable part of my life, and now find myself in ministry, which I also enjoy immensely. The word charism, I suppose I'd always heard of, but in terms of the life of the church, it was actually doing a called and gifted workshop way back in the seminary. I think it was in the year 2002. With Clara Gagan, and I remember the distinction being made that we all have gifts, we all have talents, but charisms are a particular way of contextualising those, of imagining those, and that charisms are quite specific to each one of us and can be discovered and discerned. I think the other distinction I remember when first reflecting on charisms those many years ago was that we're also invited to discern our charisms insofar as our charisms are for ultimately the service of others, of building up the church, of living out that great command of loving God and loving our sisters and brothers in front of us. The more I've been thinking about charisms, I think there's always in a sense of joy, of communion, of freshness, newness. Whenever I think charisms are being realised and celebrated, I often think of the wonderful gifts that parishioners, I find myself in the parish for most of my week now, and I think of a Sunday when we all come together as a community and the many different ways that people exercise not just their gifts but their charisms for the building up of the community. And when they're being used, the great sense of joy, we would say in our church talk, communion, community, commonness, being united in a sense of the Holy Spirit. When we come together on a Sunday in particular, I find a great sense of charisms being expressed. I suppose one of the charisms I'm called to discover as a priest is the gift of preaching, of being able to somehow relate the message of the Sunday, the gospel message and the readings to the people I share community with, and I'm invited to lead as a minister. So again, I sometimes find when, it doesn't always happen, but when I'm able to find the words that I want to for a homily, which I always try and keep quite conversational, dialogical, even though it is often a one-way expression. When that works, I find that there's a moment of joy, of communion, and I think perhaps me exercising my charisms in that regard too. I think so, and I think of the Holy Spirit, I think of that gentle voice of encouragement, calling us somewhere, calling us ultimately to the gifts of the Spirit, but also to using our charisms to celebrate the gift of the Spirit amongst us as a community. But I think of the Holy Spirit in terms of that gentle voice of peace, obviously, of consolation. And for me, it was interesting, I was speaking with a school group the other day, and they said, how did you know finally that you were called to be a priest? I shared my vocation story as I was invited to do, and I'd done that quite thoroughly, I thought, but they said, but what was the tipping point? What was the last thing that made you say, yes, I'd like to become a priest? And that was a great question, because in one sense I said, I'd discerned this for many years. I felt quite sure after discerning it for 7 or 8 years that this was where I was called to be. But I said, really, when I think about that and when I'm challenged by that question, it was really that sense of peace, of consolation, of needing to explore that as a way of being in the church. as a way of fully being alive as a member of the church as well. So I'd have to say that experience of being called was closely related to the gift of realising one's charism as well. So for me, yeah, very, very strong connection, especially given I think that the aim of realising our charisms is really for that sense of the spirit of joy, of service, and of being. Again, I think of the ministry setting I find myself in at the moment in the parish, and the many very humble ways that people live out their charisms. So obviously our charisms are quite different. We're all gifted with the Holy Spirit at baptism, and those gifts are realised and celebrated in many ways through our charisms. I'm thinking of one particular instance, not in the parish I'm in at present, but of people who worked in the parish environment, in the garden. And although they weren't able always to contribute in other ways, this was the way that they felt able to serve the parish. And they did so with great skill and with great joy, and also to ultimately for the benefit of our local church community, our parish. So for me, that was perhaps not an obvious, but a very definite way where charisms were also being exercised. Again, giving somebody a sense of great joy and of service and of contribution to the life of the church, but also in a unique way and in a particular way to that particular person and group. Certainly, I think there is always that sense of mystery in our vocations, but that shouldn't be something to deter us. I think we enter into that world of the spiritual of mystery when we enter into prayer. So I think, firstly, being able to dialogue with God, and that simple prayer of perhaps asking God to help us realise and to use our charisms. When I think of vocation, and for me, vocation and charism are so closely tied up together, I think of that famous quote of Pope John Paul II, who said, whenever we follow our own story, it always leads to God. And there's always a bit of mystery in that. I think that gives a lot of consolation. I've got a lot of hope. So I think simply by following our story, taking the time in the presence of God, in the context of prayer, we could say, to simply reflect back on my story and to see those moments of God alive and active in my story, and to see when I've been able to give moments of joy and of hope and of consolation to others, but when too, for me, that's given me a great sense of purpose and meaning. I think charisms ultimately reflect that great paradox of the Christian life, that it's in giving of ourself that we actually receive, in reaching out to others, that we actually find something of meaning and of purpose in our lives, something of communion celebrated when we reach out to others. So I think my advice would be to create some time to stop, to know that voice of the Holy Spirit's never a threatening voice or a voice of fear, but rather a voice of consolation and of peace and of invitation to explore. And then when we look at our story, to follow those very wise words of John Paul II, it always leads us to God, to the presence of the Spirit working in us. So that would perhaps be my advice, that gift of discernment that Pope Francis is calling us as a synodal church to keep very much at the top of our priorities.